Before we pick up, we left off yesterday. Just a reminder, your Zoom meeting is 10 o'clock Thursday morning. That's for the review. Your test is going to be on Friday. Please have that back to me, if not on Friday, by Sunday at the latest. And I still am looking for a few tests from some of you, and I think we've sent communication about that today. So communicate with me if you're having an issue with your test or something, but think about any questions you have for the review on Thursday. Moving on. Yesterday we were talking about Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was having successes in the Western theater, the western part of the war for the Union, where the eastern segment was not doing very well. The eastern theater, the Army of the Potomac, kept trying to reach Richmond. They couldn't do it. Lee kept beating them. But we ended where the Union controlled the Mississippi. Grant had laid siege and took Vicksburg. He had several other victories we talked about yesterday. And Lincoln sent for Grant and sent him east to face Lee. And that's where we stopped, and that's where we'll pick up today. When we get back into the battles, we're going to start off, though, talking about something else that occurred during the war, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. And the term emancipate simply just means to free. January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And it declared, and I have this quotation in your notes, but on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or part of a state whose people shall be in rebellion against the United States shall be then thenceforward and forever free. We've talked a little bit about this before in our class, but he essentially is making a statement that all the states in rebellion that had slaves, those slaves he's declaring are free. The problem with that, of course, is there were 4 slave states in the Union still that he had authority to free. He did not. Clearly that's probably smart political reasons. He was afraid they would leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Certainly wanted to win the war first. But it really changed nothing except, may have given hope in some of these situations. But so this didn't actually free any slaves at the time in the Confederacy. And then once again, the slaves in the 4 states that remained in the Union that had slavery, they were not free. And he was concerned that those states would leave the Union. But it did once again have some of the effect he wanted. It also, although it's not mentioned really in your book, it also sent the message to the European nations, either France or England, that they feared may join the Confederacy in this. Just kind of putting a stamp on it about slavery. The Western European nations, France and England, both had become very anti-slavery. So he wanted to make sure it was abundantly clear what you would be siding with if you joined the war on the South's behalf. And there were African American military units during the war. One of the most famous was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. There was a movie made about them about 20 years ago. I want to say Morgan Freeman was in that one. But one of the things, they were involved in one of the battles of July 18th, 1863. The 54th led an attack against Fort Wagner near Charleston. Half of the regiment, including its young commander, was killed. Robert Shaw was his name. He was white, but he was killed. But the loss, although it was a loss, the courage of the regiment won respect for the African American soldiers and helped with the recruitment, which added to the Union ranks, which were already superior to the Confederate ranks to start with. But it did help with that. As a side note, Shaw was killed. The Confederates buried him basically with his men, and they thought that was somewhat of an insult, a white commander being buried with his black troops. But Shaw's family viewed it, and many of his friends viewed it as an honor. So that's as a side note. But William Carney was an African American, fought in the Union, fought in that battle, became the first of 16 African Americans to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their bravery. That's a note. I made a notation of that. The man's name at the bottom of your notes, so you will need to know that. Going back to major battles as Grant gets east, the Battle of Gettysburg. This occurs in 1863, late June and very early July. Robert E. Lee moves his army north into Pennsylvania. He hoped to take the Yankees by surprise and then move south on Washington, D.C. He was kind of hoping this would be a major knockout blow. June 30th, 1863, General Jordan Meade met part of Lee's army at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And the three-day Battle of Gettysburg was one of the most important of the war. July 2nd, the Yankees took up strong position on Cemetery Ridge, which overlooked the town, and a Confederate attack failed, causing heavy casualties. The next day, this is what's critical, this is what I have notated in particular in your notes, on July 3rd, Lee decides to launch another attack, and he orders General George Pickett to lead a charge against the center of the Union line. But to get there, their men had to cross an open field and go up a steep slope. So they had to travel some distance. The Union army was in much better position, and the Pickett's charge is what it's known as. There's a picture behind my desk in the classroom. That's what that's a picture of. Y'all can look at it when and if we ever get back to class. But that failed. And the Confederates were forced to retreat and would never invade the North again. They were very fortunate the army wasn't totally destroyed upon their retreat from that. But and this became a turning point. But Lee, that's probably one of his biggest mistakes. Historians have argued about this forever. One of his general, Longstreet, tried to talk him out of it. He would not listen, and it's believed, although this isn't in your notes, not necessarily something you would need to know on the test. But it's believed, some historians have debated, he had a mild heart attack around this time. But it also is believed that he may have started thinking, hey, this is a chance to end the war, throw a big blow to end the war, and maybe his troops were invincible because they fought large odds, overwhelming odds, and they always came out. They always came out on top. So maybe he had a false sense of security there. One of the other things that was critical was, if you remember yesterday, we talked about the loss of Stonewall Jackson just a couple months prior to that, and it's believed that he would have helped the Confederates during this, certainly get in a better position prior to the battles. So that probably did make a pretty big difference. Sherman, Sherman's march to the sea. We talked a little bit about William Tecumseh Sherman, and I mentioned that in the South his name was a dirty word for a long time. But Grant and Sherman believed in total war against not only Confederate soldiers but against the civilians and resources. They thought that that's what they believed in would help bring this war to a conclusion, break the will of the people. And while putting constant pressure on the army of the Confederacy. And over the summer and fall of 1864, Sherman led over 100,000 men through Atlanta and Savannah. They destroyed everything of value as they came through. They did not leave things of value, crops or anything that were behind that the Confederate troops could use. Anything they thought was a resource was destroyed. And in December of 1864, Sherman set out for South Carolina. And there were few Confederate troops by this time to really stop him. They weren't going to stop Sherman at this point. And he moved on Columbia, and he personally wanted to be involved in attacking the capital of the state of South Carolina because it was the first state to secede, and he wanted to make a point there. And then there's been debate. I put on there after the disputed burning of Columbia, Sherman moved toward North Carolina. There's been debate whether Sherman intentionally burned it or not. My personal opinion was the Union troops did it on purpose, but that's something that's debated, and that's my opinion. But a lot of this did lead to harder feelings following the war for many, many years. By the time we're talking about Sherman coming through Atlanta, taking Columbia, and then moving back to North Carolina, it's pretty clear that the end had really was in sight of the war. The Confederate Army was worn down. They were losing men that they could not replace. And Grant's Army of the Potomac pursued Lee constantly. In 1 month of battles, the South lost 31,000 men and the North 55,000. And that was pretty shocking even at that stage of the war. There was some complaints about Grant, losing this many men. He, I think, looked at it basically like, he could replace those 55,000. The South lost 31,000. They couldn't do it. That's one thing that he was going to keep pressure and keep fighting. Doing it the other way, let's just say with a lack of aggression, was not working. That's a lot of men, but if it just keeps dragging out for several more years because you're not being aggressive, it could be debated. It's going to cost you a lot more men in that fashion. So Lee was forced to abandon Richmond. His forces were down to about 30,000 at this point. And he was hoping to link up in North Carolina with Confederate forces, but Grant cut him off. And realizing the war was lost and wanting to avoid further slaughter of his men, Lee agreed to meet with Grant, which was a very obviously difficult decision. On April 9th, 1865, he surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And then Grant did offer generous terms of surrender during this process, trying to help ease what was going to be a painful process as it was at the time. But, Lee finally realized that really to continue to resist at this point was only going to get more of his men killed, and that they didn't really have a hope of military victory. And that's where it comes. You'll need to know the date, Appomattox Courthouse, and that Grant did offer generous terms of surrender. The effects of the war: more than 360,000 Union soldiers and 250,000 Confederate soldiers lost their lives in the war, and no war has ever resulted in more American deaths. You will need to know that. And Southerners came out of it. They viewed the North with resentment. They felt like they had lost their struggle for independence. Their way of life had been forcibly changed. And the Union armies had destroyed much of their land because so much of the fighting was on their home turf. And they also feared the North would seek revenge on the South after the war. So there was a lot of bitterness that went on for a long time following the war. And Shelby Foote, I think I mentioned him, famous writer, historian, wrote several volumes on the Civil War. He was asked about it, why Southerners seem to still have a bad taste about that so many years later, why that lingered so long. And in an old interview, he said, well, he's thought about that a lot. And he said, he was probably involved in about 50 fist fights growing up. And he said, but the ones that stuck with him the most were the ones he lost. That was maybe what he was thinking in terms of why the resentment lasted so long. But states' rights took a blow, and the federal government's power grew as a result. And most importantly, though, the results of the war did bring freedom for millions of African Americans. As the outcome of the victory for the Union. And that's something that, the transition wasn't smooth, which we're going to talk about in our our next sections when we talk about Reconstruction. But that was, most importantly, the result that came from that. All right, that's where we're going to end today. Think of any questions you may have based on the notes, and we'll see you at the review on Thursday.